Mistrustful.
With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell Show. She is back, Cassandra Shand. We were on a couple of weeks ago talking about Ukraine and Russia and Putin and China and everything going on. You might have heard a few things have happened in that regard since then, so we're going to revisit it, see what we got right, see what we got wrong. Thrilled to have you back, my friend. How are you?
Good, thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, she's another one of our great partners from Young Voices. She has those fancy degree things from Cambridge and the University of Chicago and a little school called UCLA you might have heard of. Well documented. You've done a lot of studying before this. Let's just kind of zoom out for a second before we get back into Ukraine. You've done studying and writing on things like power structures and greater power dynamics. We've framed this whole thing as Russia versus NATO, and that's a big chunk of it. But what are some of the power dynamics involved here besides just that? Because we've got China involved, India's right there, Russia's right there, NATO and Europe, which are not the same thing, although everybody's kind of using those interchangeably right now. That's not accurate, and it's important to distinguish those two things. And then, of course, America. There's a lot of moving parts here. Just kind of give us the big picture power dynamics here.
Yeah, well, I think one of the most important aspects about foreign policy is that no decision, whether that be inaction or action, is isolated. Everything has an immediate effect. You might see the next day. You might see a year or two from now. But right now we have like Ukraine, Russia. That's been like kind of like a Soviet era issue, prevalent since then. We have a lot of these historical dramas in the Asian region. We have the U.S. still trying to retain its like post-Cold War era dominance, and then around like the big three players, right? China, U.S., Russia. You have a bunch of other states like India trying to kind of become maybe the next China, next America. You have countries like Taiwan and Ukraine trying to retain sovereignty. And so I think you see a big mix of these kind of like smaller players aiming for more power, middle powers trying to keep the power they have right now, and then these large dominant powers trying to struggle and maintain as much power as possible and eventually dominate the entire international system.
Yeah, and one of the things about foreign policy, I like to break things down to simple things because I'm a simple guy and I like simple concepts. The thing about foreign policy is if you're going to be effective in foreign policy, it has to be coherent and it has to be consistent. And when you're talking about these power dynamics, one of the things that's just real simple here is Vladimir Putin has had a plan for the better part of 25, 30 years on what he wants, how he wants to get there. And that's what he's doing now. And there's not that coherency in the Western countries or in the European countries. They're not coherent and they're not consistent. Part of that's because they're democratically elected and the leadership rolls over. But some of it is just fractured attention, like you said. That's just a simple dynamic that we overlook when we start talking about these things. And they're like, hey, this guy's got a plan, nobody else does. And then we wonder why everybody's being reactionary. Well, there's why you're reactionary.
No, absolutely. I think something that sets the West apart is the fact that, well, you look at China. China has a very, very blatant long-term strategic outlook. It's planning 50 years ahead. Putin, maybe not so much. I think he's very much focused on Ukraine, just like kind of like Soviet era issues. But the U.S., I think that we kind of suffer from a scatterplot foreign policy. We kind of just pick at whatever. Nothing is linear. And I'm actually kind of frustrated. I think we kind of need some sort of foreign policy accountability at this point. I think that in this past year alone, we've seen a lot of really bad foreign policy errors. And I think we're going to be paying for them as a country for years to come. But we need some sort of system in place to just check ourselves. I think none of it we're doing right now is really making sense. And I think that, this crisis itself, like this should have been, we knew about it for months. We've known about this invasion for a very long time. Again, it's an intelligence win, but it's a foreign policy failure on our part again.
Yeah, talking to Cassandra Shand from Young Voices. You brought it up. President Biden talked about it in his address yesterday. He said, we've been saying this since November. They have. This is one of those things where the intelligence actually did work. Part of the problem was, though, a lot of people didn't believe it because of everything that's gone on in the past. And then the other half of it is you can know what they're going to do all day long, but if you don't have any kind of mechanism to react or actually a willpower to react, it doesn't matter. Part of that accountability you're talking about is we're just not learning lessons anymore. We're not learning the lessons from Afghanistan. We didn't learn the lessons from the war on terror. We haven't learned the lessons from the post-Cold War era, I should say, where a lot of the seeds of what's going on with Russia right now were sown. How do we get that accountability? Because it sure doesn't look like congressional oversight is doing it. It doesn't look like the executive's interested in it. Where's this going to come from?
I think part of it is definitely this whole like, okay, we don't want to be involved in foreign conflict mentality. But I think that's made us very complacent in the way we conduct foreign policy. It's made us, we don't have to commit to anything anymore. And I think this put us in a very bad place. But one thing, at least in the past few days that I've seen, I think there's kind of a coalescing of support from both sides of the aisle around supporting Ukraine, which is, I think it's definitely a departure from what we've seen over the past like 5 or 6 years, which I think is very telling, I think, about the direction of the future of our foreign policy. This might be like just like a crazy idea, but I mean, just something as simple as like a ranking system every year of like, okay, this year we had a bad foreign policy year. Just something, just like at this point, just like any kind of like self-awareness of like how we're conducting our affairs abroad, I think is important. And I don't think. I think the biggest issue is the fact that it doesn't seem like we're retaining any lessons that we should have learned from our past errors. So yeah, I don't know. We need to change our ways. We need to be aware of where we've messed up, where we can have improvement, and we're just not doing that. And I think it really comes down to like the media, civic pressure. I mean, we need answers. This is not okay.
Yeah, I took the angle on it back when Afghanistan collapsed and when we went through all that. I went back to the Vietnam era and I drew the conclusion of, the United States military did a lot of soul searching, completely retooled how they did almost everything top to bottom. And we got the military that we had through the 90s and 2000s that was inarguably the best military in the world. But the government side of that, we never had a government process like that where the government and the foreign policy apparatus and the Defense Department, wider, meaning the bureaucratic side, they didn't go through that process. And I don't know how we ever get them to do a process like that because we had the Vietnam failure. We've had successes since then, Gulf War I, but now we've had the war on terror problems. Afghanistan, we saw what happened there. Now we have this, which is fracturing NATO. And I know everybody's united now, but how long is that really going to last? 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks? I hate to repeat the question again, but if there's no accountability here, we're just going to keep doing this over and over again. And the accountability has to come through a bureaucratic section of government that has shown itself to be very resistant.
Yeah, I honestly think it comes from the ground up. I mean, as simple as it gets, I think that, I guess like the war on terror stuff, you'd think we would have like an in place, like solidified accountability structure. Instead, we kind of rely on these like presidential election cycles, but they're clearly ineffective in mitigating any foreign policy errors. We're in the same situation, honestly. No matter what administration you look at, we have had some major foreign policy disasters, and we need to keep getting better, and we're just not. So I think it kind of starts from the bottom up. Yeah, it's disheartening for me. I mean, I'm early 20s and I love foreign policy, and I was hoping there's something left when I'm finally able to be involved myself. So.
Yeah, it's frustrating being a foreign policy person the last few years because America traditionally always has had an isolationist streak to it, but it does come in cycles where, they're more involved in the world and then they kind of retreat back. We're just in historically, because when you study foreign policy, you got to have your history down. We're just in a cycle where America just is not interested in foreign policy whatsoever right now. But that hurt. Let's go back to those power structures you talked about, the power dynamics. When we start out a negotiation with somebody like a Vladimir Putin we're not going to put any troops in the field. That's a massive leverage point that we just gave away for free right off the jump. And it just came out of kind of the predominant cycle of thought that we're in. We're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot on a lot of this foreign policy stuff just out of kind of late level laziness, aren't we?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest tells is the fact that the first sanction Biden announced, I think on Tuesday, if you look at the ruble right after his announcement, it didn't really move. That's crazy. It's crazy that, as a country, as America, we could announce like broad sweeping sanctions and they could have a very minimal immediate effect. That's rarely seen. So I think that just goes to show that we have the right tools. We're not good at choosing the right tool to use at the right time and then conveying how we're going to use that tool. And absolutely, you're 100% right. There's no reason why we should ever exclude any option. I mean, with the exception of nuclear, I mean, that's a given, I think, as a civilized country. But other than that, like,
Yeah, I agree. And to your point, the ruble did finally collapse, but it's when Boris Johnson of the UK talked about it because so much of the dirty money from the Russian oligarchy that actually runs the country goes through London. But that's another matter for another day. We're talking to Cassandra Sand. When we come back on Her Tell after the break, we're going to get into Ukraine a little more specifically, the Russian invasion, what we got right, what we got wrong when we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. We'll hold ourselves accountable since we're demanding that of the government. We'll do it of ourselves. Try to piece together where we're going to go from here. We'll be right back on Her Tell right after this. Welcome back to Her Tell. We're talking to our friend Cassandra Sand from Young Voices. Okay, let's hold ourselves up to the fire a little bit. I went back and listened, and you can on any of the podcasting platforms or the YouTube channel. You were on a couple weeks ago. We did okay on some things. We understood that this was a real threat from Vladimir Putin. We understand he was covetous of Ukraine from the Soviet era, even going back further than that, Imperial Russia, the czars. He likes to appeal to that sort of stuff. So this is a very deep thing with the history of Russia and Ukraine. We had both, I guess, hoped that this was going to be a brinksmanship thing. Clearly, that did not happen. So we were wrong there. We also hoped if he did incur, he was going to limit himself maybe to the regions that were already kind of quasi under separatist control. That's clearly not happening because he's going to drive on Kiev, and it looks like he's trying to get a land bridge built down to Crimea. What's a couple things that jumped out at you that's maybe changed in the last few weeks since we've talked about this, now that we have, I guess, day 2 or 3 of the invasion to go off of?
I think, I mean, immediately, right? I think his Putin's anti-Nazism little justification for invading Ukraine is very interesting, given the fact that Zelensky is Jewish. That was just kind of ironic to me. But I mean, and I think in a broader sense, I think things that jumped out to me the most are kind of like the West's reaction to this issue. We had like a minor, like was like an invasion to the east, a minor incursion. It created like some small sanctions on the U.S.'s part. And now what we're doing, Biden announced today, his broader round of sanctions that, I mean, are not swift sanctions, and they do not punish Putin directly. I think that was kind of a surprise to me. I thought they would have, like, the Biden administration would have gone a little further in their immediate reaction. I'm surprised that, I mean, like, I'm mostly surprised actually the fact that you see a lot of progressive groups and you see a lot of conservative groups, like, I mean, honestly, advocating for the same thing. They want military accountability with Ukraine. They want to see change. They want to help the Ukrainian people, which I think is it's surprising. I think with other conflicts, you wouldn't have seen as much bipartisan support, but this has it. So.
Yeah, lawful invasion. I mean, there's just no real way. I mean, I know we got a couple of the usual suspect talking heads on certain network TV programs that are doing it, but by and large, there's just no defensible way for a war of aggression. It's just so obvious. I think it cuts through this stuff. The other thing, and I think you were right to bring it up here, the sanctions. 2 questions that immediately jump to my mind is the administration officials on background reporters are making it very abundantly clear that they did not want to interrupt the energy flow out of Russia to Europe, which I understand why they don't want to put your allies in a bad spot, but that's the money trainer. So if you're going to do sanctions and don't touch that, what's the point of that? And the other one is, and we had this bizarre thing with President Biden taking the questions where they're straight asking him. Press actually got a little rowdy about this. Why aren't we sanctioning Vladimir Putin himself personally? By some accounts, he may be the wealthiest man in the world because of so much illicit money going through here. Yeah. Why aren't we sanctioning him directly? And the president wouldn't even touch it. Like he said, well, it's on the table, but nobody will touch that one. Why is that?
I have this like sneaking suspicion. I have 2 actually. I'm not sure which one it is. Either the U.S. we know deep down that these sanctions, once we go full out swift sanction, Putin sanction, everything, they're going to be less effective than we're intending. I think that's one consequence that the Biden administration is a little fearful of, because that would be logical. I think that's in the back of their mind. Alternatively, I think that there's a potential that in like backdoor diplomatic channels, Russia is hinting at some attack of some sort. That would make sense. Those are the only 2 reasons I could see where we wouldn't be sanctioning Putin. Because other than that, like without one of those, then there's not really logic in our sanction strategy at all. Also, to your previous question about things that have surprised me about this kind of the aftermath of like the initial invasion, is China. I did not think that China would kind of like so openly almost endorse Russia. China's had a long history of kind of remaining out of conflict. And I mean, China has not pledged any military support directly, but it's accepting wheat now from Russia, where it previously, a while has not, out of their own like fear over like wheat contaminants or whatever. But I mean, now they're like, I think that China is going to help Russia massively evade sanctions. And I think that one of the big effects of this conflict, I think we're going to see kind of a reevaluation of how the world perceives sanctions. I mean, they already have a very negative stereotype, but I think that Russia and China in particular have spent years trying to figure out ways to evade sanctions. And I think that might be part of the reason why we have not gotten most of sanctions yet.
Yeah, talking to Cassandra Shan, two things that jumped out at me about the sanctions also was when he listed the countries involved. The two glaring omissions of countries involved was China, like you said, which was not overly surprising, but the other one was India was not mentioned. Now, China, we understand what's going on. India, I get it because it's not only economic for them, and not only are they in a rock and a hard place because they got things like, Pakistan and Kashmir, and then they've got, the China influence that they're dealing with. Their entire military structure is based off Russian equipment, almost all of it, to the point that, remember, a couple of years ago, we kind of did the handshake deal and wink, wink, nudge, nudge of we're not going to raise a stink even though you're our ally because you're buying stuff from, because they'd have to restructure their entire defense system. So we kind of just looked the other way on that. So I kind of get that. But even if you really crack down on them, and we saw the Soviet economy react to the London ones because all the money goes through London. If India and China are not on board with these sanctions, they may hurt, but they're not going to be critical because that's a big chunk of economy and open commerce that they're going to have available to them just from those two countries alone. And there's going to be all the subsidiaries that come along with it. Did that jump out at you too, that those two nations were not mentioned?
Absolutely. It's just, it's increasingly concerning. I'm not convinced of the effectiveness of sanctions in this case. I think that, Putin invaded anyways. I think it's as simple as that. He's known the biggest threat is Swift sanctions, and he's did it anyways. I also think it was interesting today because while Russia's invading Ukraine, China's done another one of the flyovers, Taiwan. Yeah, I mean, can you imagine like scary times?
It's scary times, and of course Taiwan's a little different because it is an island. They would have to do amphibious, and that's a whole nother beast of thing. But China's got their eye on other areas besides just Taiwan too. Yeah, and the concern too is if he doesn't stop in Ukraine, does he start looking at does he start looking up in the north and start looking at Estonia and Latvia and those places? Like, well, I'd like to have them back too because they have been very successful countries independently. Does he start looking at other places? I've been struck because I've just from observing him for a while, his demeanor on television, the way, even his syntax of his speech, and I know we're working off translators, so it's a little different. He looks completely different. He sounds completely different. His mannerisms are completely different. What does that tell you about this? Is this just him in his final form where he's just, all out of F's to give and he's just being himself? Is it the pressure of it? Is something going on with him? I know there's been rumors about his health and such. Is this just in-stage dictator where, he's been around yes men so long that he really has lost touch with reality? What do you make of it? Because it's glaringly obvious to anybody that's watched Vladimir Putin. He is very, very different the last couple of weeks when he's appeared in public.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually. I thought it was interesting that he announced the invasion out of like a pre-televised, pre-recorded television segment. I thought that was a kind of unique in itself. Then again, like he's definitely been planning this invasion for a while. At least since November, like the invasion itself, like we've been pretty confident about it for the past few months. So I'm not sure if anything immediate has changed with Putin, but no, he's Ukraine is his issue. This has been his like a fixation for years. So I while it does come as a surprise to me that he has invaded, I truly did think that it would just be like kind of a rallying cry to keep getting him elected. I don't think it's as simple as just putting in like a new like puppet dictator in Ukraine. I think he wants Ukraine as part of Russia. So
I think he does too. And one thing that kind of gives me a little bit of hope, though, is, for him to win here, he actually has to take over the country in some shape or form, even if it's through a puppet or whatever. For the Ukrainians to win, they just got to stay in the field and try to delay this thing out and make it cost the Russians enough that eventually they're going to have to pull out and stop. What kind of time frame are we realistically looking for? Would they have to hold out for weeks? Would they have to hold out for months? We know Russia's economy is going to be taking some hits here. We know that there's international pressure. Realistically, though, what's the time frame we're looking at that Ukraine would have to stay in the field and at least not have a total collapse of Kiev or their government to really put pressure on Putin and better yet, the people that Putin has to listen to, his oligarch buddies, and that's kind of the crime syndicate that runs Russia. Is that weeks? Is that months? How long would they have to hold out to really get enough pressure to maybe change the dynamic here?
It honestly really depends on what Russia decides to do next. I think that an underrated weapons in its arsenal. Thermobaric rockets. That's just crazy. I mean, can you imagine if instead of nuclear, it's a step below nuclear. It's not chemical. It's not biological, but there's super high power rockets that if you're within like the vicinity of a shockwave, your lungs collapse. I mean, that's crazy. But I could very well see Russia kind of pursuing that route. And if Russia does like kind of escalate beyond like I see what we now view as like conventional military weapons, it's a whole different ballgame. And I think NATO might intervene, the UN might intervene, but the US itself will intervene. And I think that we as like the West suffers. Russia has a very clear tactical and operational dominance, I think, already. I don't think we'll be able to, come close to that. So I don't know if it's a matter of Ukraine holding out. I just don't know what Russia's thinking. They've taken out a ton of sites in a day. I think 70 targets have been, according to Russia. That's very quick. Kind of surprised at Russia's ability to kind of enter Ukraine as quickly as it did from 3 different sides. I think Belarus. I think the U.S. at the very minimum should be very hard on Belarus. Like right now, I don't think we're hard enough. I think it should be all over the news. The fact that Belarus is kind of key to Russia's success. But I think the situation is very kind of disappointing. I think if you look at the demographic makeup of Ukraine, I think I've seen some estimates where it's roughly 17% of the population, including Crimea, is pro-Russia, which again is not very much at all. Russia's in Kiev, but Americans, we didn't really think. Our national security saw Kiev as the potential, but we didn't do anything, but we've let it happen at this point. Like we knew they were going to invade, and we slapped on some small sanctions, and that's kind of been it. So I honestly think that as a country, we've kind of left Ukraine to the wolves. It's just sad.
And to not to be really negative here for a second, though, as much as we're talking about how bad it would be if Russia takes over Ukraine, I don't know if people have understood that if this doesn't work for Putin, this is an all or nothing move for him. If this fails and he loses face and Ukraine can at least hold out or make it very costly for him, you have destabilized Russia. Belarus will probably be destabilized because not only do you have because Putin's the only thing that held Lukashenko in power. So that could destabilize. There's actually no good win here because either Ukraine falls and the region destabilizes, or Russia loses face and Putin's aura falls and that destabilizes everything. That could actually almost be worse in some ways. So there's no good answer here. This is going to go bad either which way. Is that overstating the facts though?
No, I think that's pretty accurate. I think for me at least, the announcement, the news headline, right, of Ukraine's been invaded. It'll be one of those like moments I remember in my life. Where was I when I saw the headlines? I think this is something that's we're going to see these effects of the Russia-Ukraine crisis for years to come, and Russia is completely responsible for everything that happens. And Putin doesn't really have an option. He has to win. you're absolutely right. I mean, he can't go home to Russia with his head hanging down. He can't yeah, he's going for the kill. I that's how it is now. When we were back discussing brinksmanship, that was a different story. But yeah, he's crossed the line.
I've actually worried, and I'm just talking out loud here. I'm not, so understand where I'm coming from with this. If it looks like they're not going to win in Ukraine, I think that's when this gets really, really dangerous, because then what are they really capable of? So just kind of something to keep in the back of their mind. We hope the Ukrainians hold them off. We'll see. This is the early stages of this thing. This is all staging right now. The real big push into the country will come probably in the next day or two militarily. So we'll have to update it then. Cassandra Shan, thank you for coming back. Probably going to have to make you a regular on this, because we're going to have to keep talking about this for God knows how long, because this is really going to be something that changes a lot of geopolitics for a long time to come. Let folks know where they can find you on your social media and your writing stuff. You're on Young Voices with us, and we're proud to have you with us. Let people know where they can follow you and follow your work.
Yeah, sure thing. You can follow me on Twitter at Cassandra Shand. Thank you.
Thrilled to have you back. Thank you for coming back on. We'll see how our predictions and analysis hold up here in another week or two. And more another, we hope there's not just massive bloodshed. It looks hard to avoid, but we still hold out hope for the Ukrainian people above all else.
We are praying for them.
Yep. Cassandra Sand, thank you so much for the time, man. Really appreciate you.